then thank you, and really thank you for having me. You will be sorry, obviously, but you're Canadian, so you'll be very polite about it, I'm sure. When trying to figure out a talk to a diverse audience, so some people will know too much about it, some people will not know enough, and trying to catch everyone. So I'll throw in things, and in the Q&A we'll develop what catches your attention, and so forth. It's a well-established argument that international humanitarian regime between the 1940s and the 1970s was focused on constitution of norms and standard setting, and we really moved on to enforcement since the 1970s. That's a very that's the accepted view, and it's also true. So I follow that argument, and even though the Genocide Convention, the United Nations Convention for the Punishment and Prevention for the Crime of Genocide from 1948, even though, as opposed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention has a far stronger enforcing element. It's truly binding, it's a convention, it's not a declaration. It's allegedly phrased in a binding, truly enforceable manner. I do argue that when it was phrased in the 1940s, it was really all about norm making. They really had no enforcement pretenses or expectations, not that they would have opposed occasional enforcement, but they never expected it to happen. And actually, they really thought that trying to enforce it in a rigid, actual way will cause more trouble than help world stability and so forth. Now, what I do argue, and that's what I'll try to suggest as my contribution, is that at the time, that concrete certain normative framework, part of which was the Genocide Convention, was not as salutary or utopian as we might expect. That if our standard understanding of the Genocide Convention is this single great moment in which, after the horrors of the Holocaust, humanity really came together and said, never again. And obviously afterwards, politics came back and people became people, and it did happen again. But this moment was a genuine moment of hope, of really breaking through and saying never again. Well, but that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case, and more so, it was about setting a standard, but an anti-utopian standard. And it was part of a rather grim outlook of human existence and the way to contain horror within the international system. Now, I will just state the argument just now so you'll know where things are going, to have like a title. And so I will be trying to argue that the Genocide Convention legitimized the unprecedented vast re-engineering of ethnoscapes in the aftermath of the Second World War by means of population transfer, expulsion, and resettlement. The people at the time call it the ethnic shifting of minorities. By this, now the Genocide Convention was useful in this regard because it contrasted this practice of ethnic transfers with the actual extermination and physical annihilation of people. So the Genocide Convention really generated a divide, a distinction that did not exist beforehand between uprooting people, resettling them, transferring people in a very obviously crippling and partially murderous fashion, but distinguishing between this and actually and intentionally exterminating them. So this is actually what the Genocide Convention did, hence suggesting that it's not that bad if you get uprooted, expelled, and sent somewhere else. You could have been genocide. And actually what they're saying that if you won't do that, if you will not re-engineer on an unprecedented scope the ethnoscape of mostly Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe, but also parts of the Middle East and Asia, you will have genocide again and again. So it's actually a precaution against genocide. Now, I wanna actually start in 1988. A guy called Yehonatan ElCana. Yehonatan ElCana was 10 when he survived Auschwitz. He walked out of Auschwitz as a 10-year-old. His family was originally from Yugoslavia. He found refuge in the newly established state of Israel in 1948. He was not unique in that. 500,000 European Jews were resettled in the newly founded state of Israel. He's actually a quite of a success story. He got a scholarship to Harvard. He was a historian of physics in Harvard. He did return to Israel. He was one of the founders of Tel Aviv University, and afterwards he founded the Central European University in Budapest, and he was the president and rector until 2008. You heard of ElCana? However, although this guy, he died in 2011. Although this remarkable guy have a lot to show for, he's mostly remembered within the Israeli public discourse because of an article he published in Haaretz, which is the Israeli Globe and Mail. Really, that's about it. It's better, obviously, it's better, but that's... and it's an opinion column, actually. And that's the thing he's most remembered for. Now, the title, it's a very provocative one, is The Need to Forget. Now, in histories that try to reconstruct the history of collective memory and Holocaust remembrance in Israel, this article, this opinion column, is regarded as a watershed, as one of the great moments in which something changed. He, as a Holocaust survivor, obviously he could voice opinions and use arguments that people will not be using if they don't have the credential of a Holocaust survivor. He knew what he was speaking. He was criticizing the political effects of the way the Holocaust was remembered in Israel in 1988, obviously ever since it became much worse. So he was criticizing without understanding what the future lies, what lies ahead. He actually argued for the first time that the Israel approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is rooted in the way the Holocaust is remembered. What in South Africa they will refer to as the fortress mentality, the lager mentality. This assumption of a small threatened nation that is surrounded by a world that is anxious to kill it and so forth is fueled by a very certain memory of the Holocaust. And he actually argued that Israel will do best by forgetting the Holocaust. Don't teach the children anymore, don't speak about it enough. And that was before we were all forced to go to Auschwitz to walk with flags on us and so forth. So it just began then. So he saw where things are going. It was a horrible controversy, generated a lot of anger, and he was actually in a recent book by Elchanan Yakira, it came out in Cambridge University Press, arguing that post-Zionism is Holocaust denial. He was actually blamed of being a Holocaust denier, which is a weird claim to make for a Holocaust survivor. I don't think many people, yeah, it's weird. But anyway, I want to, the most quoted part of this article argues that two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. a minority who assert this must never happen again, and the frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen to us again. So he contrasted two Jewish nations that emerged from Auschwitz. Those who said this will never happen again, and those who said this will never happen to us again. Now, the juxtaposition of those two statements strikes me as doing far more than ElCana intended in his article. ElCana was actually making a very common case of how could Israel deny the Armenian genocide. It just stopped because we are no longer friends with the Turks, but until 2 years ago we were very much denying the Armenian Holocaust. So how could Israel do that? How could Israel sell arms to Rwanda during the genocide? How could Israel be so not mobilized to prevent genocide wherever it happens? And it was actually contrasting the universalist particularist polarity. This universal approach, genocide must never happen, to a very particular, genocide must never happen to us. And if it happens to other people, well, they should have fought better. And if, in order to make sure that genocide will never happen to us, some other nation must be genocide, well, it's a tough world out there. Now, this universalist particularistic polarity that is the, I guess, the on the surface interpretation of this never happened and never happened to us again, is the axis around which the Holocaust studies, genocide studies controversy revolves around. You have scholars of the Holocaust arguing that comparison in the way that it's performed in genocide scholarship is really uncalled for. The Holocaust is too unique. Holocaust studies should focus on what actually happened in the Holocaust, and usually trying to put it within a comparative framework actually diminishes our understanding of the episode, doesn't contribute to it. And a lot of the time you really find that genocide scholarship takes an issue of suggesting that the Holocaust was less than it's advocated to be, that it was less interesting, it was less worthy of so much attention, while Holocaust studies really advocate that trying to look at the interrelations between the Armenian genocide, between colonial genocidal practices and whatever happened in the Holocaust is actually bad scholarship and might border on Holocaust denial and so forth. Now, in a sense, it's a bigger issue that we as historians should be interested in. It's the tension between the ideographic and the nomothetic, between really focusing on describing a particular thing in its unique features, really looking to the thing in itself, as opposed to really using general laws, general theories, and contextualizing in a comparative fashion. And in a weird way, historiography is always fighting how to do it properly, how to balance between those two approaches. Now, I do think that this will never happen to us, will never happen again. Options is actually does more, because it also catches two different perspectives that people don't take the time to note. And that's the difference between genocide is understood by hegemonic and self-assured nations, the US, Canada, certain European nations. Genocide is something that happens to someone else. Genocide is someone that might happen to someone else out there. And the question is, will we waste resources and energy or even do something that is not conducive to our immediate interests by helping someone else in some remote part of the world. Genocide as the problem of some meek nation somewhere in Africa and so forth, and the perspective of people who are genuinely anxious because genocide might happen to them. The perspective of nations that for them genocide is not a question of regarding the suffering of others, but an actual threat, an actual calculation of their own politics. Now, those two perspectives exist, and they are not easily brought together, and they generate a very different discourse with regard to genocide, with regard to those issues. Obviously, I'm immediately referring to Israelis, but also Afrikaners in South Africa. This is what I'm doing now, looking at genocidal anxieties of Afrikaners, but also the Alawis in Syria. Currently, they do more of the killing nowadays, but with time. And obviously the Kurds, and these are only some examples, there are many more. In a sense, one could say that ElCana mixes the cause and the effect. The reason why Israelis tend to think in terms of this will never happen again to us is because they're anxious. This is why they focus on themselves, not the other way around, because they think that it will never happen to us again. They have this weird picture of the world in which everyone wants to kill them. Now, what we see in this will never happen to us, this will never happen again, is actually the two solutions or reactions to the problem of genocide that emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we see the resettlement of over 500,000 European Jews in the newly established State of Israel, and obviously at the expense of the Palestinians that happened to live there, and the creation of the Genocide Convention in the specific way in which it was phrased. Now, the two things happened in 1948 by chance. It was not concerted in a way that will make those two things happen at the same year. It so happened that they did. They both happened in the aftermath of the Second World War, and just to make the argument stronger, it happens by unrelated reasons in 1948. Now, research has so far failed to understand those two solutions in their complex relation to each other. So far, we think of those two things in a separated, unrelated fashion, hence crippling and distorting our understanding of either. Now, this, although the complex interrelation does appear in the drafting process of the convention itself. When the people draft the convention, they do speak of the way those things are interconnected. For example, the Iranian representative, at some point when just in the very beginning of the drafting discussions, argued that in the very opening of the committee meetings, actually wished to remind the committee of the appeal for the suppression of genocide made by outstanding personality, among whom was the late Count Bernadotte. Now, Count Volker Bernadotte was the UN representative that was sent to Israel-Palestine to try and settle the conflict, try to solve in a rather justly and lawful way the conflict in Israel-Palestine, and he was assassinated by a radical right Zionist fraction, the Lehi, the Stern Gang. And given that Volker Bernadotte was one of the leaders of the Swedish Red Cross and was very much involved in saving Jews during the Second World War, this situation in which this savior is then assassinated by allegedly, how do you say it, when you don't show thank you? ungrateful, by allegedly ungrateful victims. Now, referring to Polka Bernadotte and this particular issue in which he was assassinated is obviously no coincidence in the very opening of the drafting discussions. But it obviously it had a more pronounced expression. Weirdly enough, the violence in Israel-Palestine in 1947-1948 is after the perpetration of the Nazis, the single most referred to historical event in the 2-year drafting process of the Genocide Convention. They don't speak about anything but the perpetration of the Nazis as much as they speak about what's going on in Israel-Palestine. This, although the displacement and partition of India and Pakistan, 14 million people uprooted, 1 million of them dying in the process. It was mentioned 4 times. The Japanese occupation of China was mentioned 3 times. The Spanish Civil War and subsequent political persecution under Franco was mentioned twice. And the most amazing thing, a general reference to genocidal activity taking place in colonial setting, that happened once. And the Gulag camp system, which was referred to indirectly once. So, as we can see, it's a very politically weird distribution of attention. Now, Syria and Egypt argue that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Israel-Palestine as the convention is being drafted, arguing that the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians is an act of genocide. This is voted against in the end, as the practice of mass expulsions is not regarded a genocidal act. This is one of the key thing in the Genocide Convention, but this is argued through what is happening in Israel-Palestine. This, although most of the world is being expelled and resettled as they speak. So choosing Israel-Palestine is not the only case in which one can speak of the subject. One can speak about 13 million Volksdeutsch, ethnic Germans that are being expelled from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe into Germany. 2 million of them die in the process. So 13 million Volksdeutsch, 2 million of them die in the process. You can obviously also speak of that example, but this was not the case. Now, how are we doing with time? How long do I have actually? Like 40 minutes? Sure. Yeah, okay. Stop me when you're really bored. Now, what we have when we think of those two, two solutions to the problem of genocide, never again to us, never again in general, is when we fail to see that those two come together and they're interrelated, we have two distinct narratives of how the both of them came round. How did the resettlement of Jews in newly established Israel after the war and the Genocide Convention came about? Now, what we can call the Whiggish narrative of the Genocide Convention, the standard, salutary, progress intensive narrative of how we have the Genocide Convention. So it's a narrative that actually begins, weirdly enough, with the moral outrage against the fate of the Armenian during the First World War. So we have Christians in Europe, but also in North America, horrified by what's going on in the Ottoman Empire. They have various civil society activities against that. To an extent, states are mobilized to do something. The American ambassador, Morgenthau, in Istanbul is documenting what's going on and expressing his horror, actually being very much concerned that the Jewish settlement in Palestine will be next. This is something he's very much concerned with, and he actually believes that what's going on with the Armenian is an actual danger to the Jewish settlement in Palestine. Now, there was supposed to be a trial after the First World War. They were supposed to, the perpetrators, not of the highest rank, but the second rank and below, were supposed to face justice after the First World War. It was actually mentioned in the Paris Peace Agreement, but politics came in the way. The British interest became not comfortable about antagonizing the populations in Anatolia in this fashion, and by 1921 it all disappeared, resulting in further massacres of surviving Armenian communities in the region, as people understood what might happen if those survivors will continue to scandalize about what was done to them and so forth. So it happened really sadly, this aborted attempt to bring justice to this horrible thing. Now, there was a guy called Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin, everyone heard of him? No one heard of him? Someone heard of him? Raphael Lemkin, there was a time in which no one knew who he was. He was utterly forgotten, but then he had this remarkable renaissance, and everyone knows about him now. He's a Polish-Jewish legal professor from Warsaw University that he ended up coining the term genocide, and he's the father of the Genocide Convention. In 1933, Lemkin understands that what happened to the Armenians might happen to other minorities in the world. Living a Jew in Poland, he has this feeling that this won't be a one-time episode. However, he completely failed to convince anyone that he's right. And this is part of what the Whiggish narrative of the Genocide Convention is so fascinated by, how people were so smug, how he tried in 1933 of all years to suggest an international law against what he called at the time barbarism, which is the intentional extermination of people because of their group identity. And in 1933 of all years, he could not convince anyone that this merits an actual attempt. You know, why would anyone try to kill people because of their identity? It's not something we should be concerned with. The paranoid Jews, don't you have a party? They're like the Zionist or something, no? Go there. He wasn't a Zionist, which is a fascinating thing. We go back to that. Now, so Lemkin was very frustrated in 1933, but there was nothing he could do. Sadly enough, the Second World War did happen, and his entire family was murdered, and he managed, through connections, to find refuge in the United States by 1941. Being the sole remnant of his family and fairly traumatized by this Cassandra-like faith of his. When Churchill announced on the radio the signing of the Atlantic Charter, in this great pathos of his, he declares that in the East, the Germans are perpetrating a crime without a name. This great quote of Churchill, that there is a crime without a name being perpetrated back in the East, and Lemkin allegedly says, but there will be a name. And so he coined the term genocide to depict this crime without a name. He published a chapter called Genocide in his book from 1943, Axis Wall in Occupied Europe, which is an amazing research of Nazi tactics of really transforming occupied Europe by means of legal and extrajudicial means. An amazing in-depth study of German techniques. especially when you think that this is a Jewish refugee in the States. How does he get the material? How does he have the peace of mind? It makes you feel that, you know, how difficult is it to write good history? Why are we failing? In Nuremberg, the term genocide is not used in the judgment, although Lemkin tried his best to get the term genocide used in the judgment. The Nuremberg tribunal felt that this is not a good idea to use a term that was just now invented. It's too much of a victor justice manifestation. You can't blame them for perpetrating something that didn't have a name, let alone a law against at the time. And as against to what we usually think, or some of us, Nuremberg was not about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was not something that stood in the middle of Nuremberg or was much of an issue. That was not what Nuremberg was about. This is something we only retrospectively project on Nuremberg. Now, being frustrated with what happened in Nuremberg, Lemkin lobbies in the UN and finally manages to have a convention being drawn up, a convention against genocide for the first time in history. Finally, humanity says no, never again. Politics get in the way. So the political group is being omitted. It must be a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, no political group, and there is no cultural genocide. First Nations, sorry, no cultural genocide. So, but this is politics, what can you do? So it's not the best convention, but this is what humanity managed to get by 48. So that's the Whiggish narrative. Now, there's a lot of ways in which this narrative is false. It didn't look like that. It didn't happen like that. So we will only touch one very distinct element. But in order to understand how the Genocide Convention came to be with the resettlement of the Jewish refugees from the Holocaust in the newly founded of Israel, we need to acknowledge that the focus actually of both things is the minorities question. It all resolves around the notion of minorities, and now the minority issue is actually the problem of the age of democratization. Democratization as opposed to the age of democracy, we have this tendency of saying the age of democracy as if democracy is already here and it's a static, fully established thing. But the problem with democracy is that it's a process, that it's in the process of becoming. And this is what generates all the problems, that we keep on understanding more and more what democracy is all about. And in a concrete fashion, the process of democratization generates groups of populations that scandalize around their exclusion. More and more populations in the process of democratizations discover that they are being treated in an exclusionary fashion. And if this is a truly democratic society, then they should not be excluded. This is the problem of minorities. It began with Jews in the 19th century. It moved on to other ethnic minorities in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1950s, women discovered that they are a minority. In 1950, there is an article in the American Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, saying that women are a majority and explaining why they're a majority, why they are a non-hegemonic group of the population that is excluded and should be, and so forth. So, and we have gays as a minority, and we have people dealing with disabilities as a minority. We have a growing phenomenon of segments of the population reconstituting their political position in minoritarian terms. Now, it's a problem, the problem of minorities, because it's unsettling. In the age of democracy, we have this question of who is the people, right? We say we the people. So who is this people that is we? And the problem is when the demos becomes entangled with the hegemonic ethnos. When the answer, who is the demos, is, well, the Aryan race, of course, while the Jewish ethnos, and so forth, while the WASPs are the demos, and so forth, the whites. This is a problem, right? Because then there are people who are not part of the demos, but they still live here. And we need to do something about them. Now, in the First World War, we have a reckless mobilization of ethnic minorities by the enemy powers in order to attain strategic, in order to win the war, you call the Armenians to help you, and in return, they'll get a state. This is what the Russian Empire promises Armenian population in eastern Anatolia. Help us and we will give you a nation. Britain calls the Jewish settlement in Palestine, help us and we will give you a nation state. It's called the Balfour Declaration. Throughout Eurasia, both sides call to national minorities that are being excluded or oppressed, promising them usually a state or at least equal rights in return for acting as a fifth column, acting as a Trojan horse. Now this is a very strategically wise, it makes sense, and in a sense, this structure of referring to oppressed populations as the head of the spear, as the segment of the population through which you can work, is something that is still present in contemporary politics. We address oppressed women, we addressed oppressed gays now in Russia. We address oppressed segments of the population, calling them to be part of this great democratizing process and so forth. During the Cold War, it was used again and again, this help us and good things will happen. Sometimes it didn't end well, but then again, you bet on the wrong horse, then it's a bad world to live in. Now, after the First World War, there is this attempt to deal with the problem of minorities, understanding that this agitating minorities that are frustrated can be dealt with by means of international law, the minority treaties. Certain states, newly created states in Eastern, Southern, and Central Europe are being subjected to minority treaties who force those states to be nice to their minorities. You can't oppress them too much. You need to respect their both collective and individual rights. Now, only newly formed semi-civilized states are subjected to minority treaties. Fully civilized states, Britain, France, and Germany, are not subjected to those minority treaties because they know how to behave without a treaty hanging over their heads. Now, this non-universalistic selective mode sounds weird to us today, but it made sense at the time. It was this notion of civilization, and civilized nations know how to behave. Non-civilized nations don't know how to behave, and semi-civilized nations need to be helped. Now, the minority protection system was meant to really make sure that minorities are not oppressed and could live in a world in which not every ethnic group gets a state. That's the problem with nationalism, right? That every ethnic group should have a state, but not enough room in the world because Canada needs to be that big. Now, in this context, Lemkin's proposal for a law against barbarity should actually be understood as part of the minority treaties system. what Lemkin desires is actually criminalizing any attempt to over-oppress minorities. When you look at his proposition in 1933, he actually says, let's make it into an actual crime, an actual international crime, to exterminate ethnic minorities, which is obviously one way of overly oppressing them. Now, the reason why it was shelved is because by 1933, everyone understood that the minority treaties system is a failed system. It doesn't work at all. Now, it doesn't work because not all states are subjected to it. So states that are subjected to it feel a bit embarrassed and annoyed by the fact that they're second-rate states. Another problem is that the biggest ethnic minority in Europe at the time are the Germans. If there is one big minority in European nations, is Germans. And Germans are using the minority treaty system, especially Nazi Germany, in order to mobilize those ethnic Germans outside Germany and actually use it to promote their political agenda, which a lot of people felt that is not coherent with the general purposes of the minority treaties, especially since Germany itself has no need to answer for its treatment of the Jews, for example, because again, Germany was not subjected to the minority treaties. But above all, the League of Nations is not an efficient way of regulating the international sphere. The League of Nations doesn't have enforcing mechanisms. It has no actual ability to protect minorities, and no one thinks it works. On the contrary, a lot of people think that because of the minority treaties, minorities have an over-preserved sense of group identity. They don't assimilate, and it's considered a failed concept by 1933, and this is why Lemkin's proposal is being shelved, or could be argued to be shelved at that point. Now, what happens if we'll move to closure? What happens after the Second World War is that the notion of the minority problem is preserved, obviously. It's understood that it's a huge problem, minorities, but no longer do people believe that international law and rules will help. You need to re-engineer the ethnoscapes. You need to move people around. You need to physically create ethnically homogeneous states in order to make sure that such things will never happen again. So it's a geopolitical solution, a geo-ethnic political solution to the problem, as opposed to a purely legal solution. Don't tell people do not behave badly, but re-engineer the world so as the problem will not be there anymore. Now, the problem is that before the Second World War, there was no distinction between physically exterminating people and moving them around. Uprooting people en masse and resettling them somewhere else, which rarely happens in an orderly, nice fashion. If you uproot people en masse and send them somewhere else, some of them will die in the process. Usually people don't go easily. It's a sad thing, and bad things happen, to the point in which this distinguishing between extermination and uprootment is not that easy. However, and before the Second World War, there is no such distinction. It's all considered part of this oppression of minorities. After the Second World War, with the creation of the Genocide Convention, you have a very clear difference. You have genocide, which is truly horrible and must never happen, when you physically exterminate a group by means of killing them physically. And then you have uprootment of groups and resettling them, which is not nice, and in any case cannot be a habit. It must be done once and for all, re-engineer everything so it works, and that will be that. And that's not genocide. It's obviously not that fun, but you cannot regard it as something that must never be done. More so, it's a precaution against genocide. Now, you really see that if you look at the Zionist arguments for the establishment of the State of Israel and for resettling the European Jews in Israel. Jews must not live among the Gentiles because then genocide happens. The solution to the Jewish problem is having a Jewish state in which all the Jews will live. Now, the fact that Europe's Jewish problem is solved at the expense of someone else and outside Europe is part of the still colonial framework of, well, it's the rest of the world that will have to deal with the European surplus populations. What can you do? In any case, in a weird way, instead of arguing that maybe people can live together, instead of arguing that multi-ethnic societies are possible, or at least can be managed in certain ways, the answer in the aftermath of the Second World War is that it will end in genocide, or there is too good a chance. And hence, the solution must be homogeneous states in which you have just one ethnos. Yugoslavia is the exception, and when the war broke out in Yugoslavia, you could see people saying, well, this is what happens. You didn't do what was necessary at the time. You were against that, and it's true. The only voice in the UN in the second half of the 40s arguing for multi-ethnic solutions and arguing that, for example, in Israel, Palestine, everyone must live together is the Yugoslavian voice. Now, you thought that you can break the system. You thought that you can all live together. Well, see what happens. This weird way in which the Zionist solution agrees that Jews cannot live with Gentiles, that they must be uprooted from Europe. There is no place for Jews in Europe. This weird, not even tacit, agreement with this weird logic that is manifested in the fact that those people are resettled in Israel, which is now the natural homeland of Jews, right? Because we were away for 2,000 years and now we are back. And this very much ideological, weird reason, but it makes sense all of a sudden. Now, obviously, I could do a better job presenting the argument, but maybe in the Q&A. So, thanks.
So, questions? You'll have to excuse me if I have the details wrong here.
Yeah.
But your definition, or the definition from the Genocide Convention of genocide as killing people, different from population transfer. I accept that, except that is there not a clause about separating children from? Can you explain like how? Because that seems very different and implies a really different logic of what genocide is. Can you tell me like how that came to be included?
Yeah. It's a great question, and not in the Canadian sense. It's a really great question because I was looking actually at the debates with regard to the children, because exactly that's the only place in which all of a sudden not killing people but just moving them away or taking them away is considered genocide. Now, how would you, because they are universally agreeing that uprootment is not genocide, but then all of a sudden if you just take the kids away, now that is genocide. Now the whole thing about getting the kids, now the logic per se is a biological logic, because if you take the kids away, then those people cannot procreate, they will not have the next generation, hence they are being extinct, just not by physically killing them, but just taking their kids away. Hence, forcibly sterilizing is also genocide. It was never enforced. The fact that only in the 1970s did a Western nation stopped forcibly sterilizing people dealing with mental disabilities. It's an entire subject, but so that's the logic. But interesting enough, historically speaking, the practice of taking kids away is a practice that the international community has a problem with for a long time now. First of all, it was one of the practices in which in settler colonies people got slaves, kidnapping kids and enslaving them, especially in South Africa. And this is one of the cases against the Afrikaners made by the British Empire, that they steal the kids of local ethnic groups. They kidnap the kids for enslavement, and they did. This practice lived throughout the end of the 19th century. Now, the notion of stealing of kids, of taking away kids, in various ways, if it's the nice Australian, Canadian way of taking them to boarding schools to properly educate them and teach them how to clean, because hygiene is cleanliness next to godliness. Now, this is one form of doing it, and you have in the Ottoman Empire a much less boarding school oriented practice by means of taking kids as servants, but also in order to convert them into Islam, to convert them into Christianity. This stealing of kids, it connects to just now we had this thing about Roma and Sinti people in Europe. There was a white kid discovered among them. They steal kids. Now, my grandmother still believes that. In all her heart, she does. They steal kids. I don't think she has ever seen a gypsy, but never mind, she knows. Now, this is, so this anxiety about theft of kids, about removal of kids, it exists. It has a history of trying to outlaw it and practice it, and it's connecting into the genocide thing, and it proves that taking away people and moving them around can be genocidal. So, yeah.
Maybe I'll ask one. You flagged, of course, the absence of politics in the convention. I wonder if you could talk about how in the run-up to and then in the aftermath of the convention and sort of the creation of the convention itself, what various activists' debates about, if you will, political genocide have been. I mean, how is that negotiated?
So first of all, it's fascinating to see that Lemkin itself opposed the inclusion of the political group. Lemkin himself thought that genocide is all about ethnicity. That genocide is about ethnic groups, about cultural, lingua-cultural groups, and that the political group is not relevant to his notion of genocide. And so he was against that from the beginning, which is interesting. The political group is placed there in the early drafts. It's obvious to everyone, and again, after the Second World War, exterminating people because of their political identification is such a vast practice. And Germans did put political dissidents in concentration camps. They did exterminate them, and let alone what's going on in the Eastern Bloc. So the extermination of people because of political opinions is an obvious form of genocide. More so, Denmark argues that, but what is a national group, and even a racial group, if not a political group? Weirdly enough, Denmark makes the social constructivist argument, 30 years before we have it in actual theory, that it is a political group. It's people that are politically deciding that a certain part of their identity is the meaningful identity. And so you have this attempt to argue that the political group is an actual form of genocide. Now, the US and Britain are pushing for the political group for obvious reasons. It's a way for them to address something that takes place in the USSR and does not take place in the US at the time. It's true that the Red Scare of the McCarthy era is taking place as the convention is being debated. So there is a certain political persecution atmosphere, but they're not exterminated. not in the way that things are practiced and have been practiced in the Soviet Union. The notion of political group does work with the liberal conception of one should not exterminate people because of their opinions. It's a way to really bound political persecutions, but above all, racism, which the USSR pushes as the pinnacle of genocide. The genocide is because of racial conceptions. It's because of this insanity in which the identity of a person is inscribed on his body. This notion of unalterable essence forcing you to kill certain people instead of assimilating them, instead of, making them right, which at the time people think it's not that bad, Americanize yourself. It's not that bad. Learn English. People can deal with it. Become a capitalist. So this weird notion of people are not genetically, because it's not in this language anymore yet, but racially speaking, people are deformed in a way that necessitates their extermination. This is the problem of genocide. This is the Soviet argument, because the USSR at the time is proud of being the anti-racial per se. Now, the US and Britain and France, they don't like this anti-racial thing too much. There are different forms of racism, and some racism is really Nazi, but there are nice racism, Thinking that people should be at their place, God didn't make everyone equal. If the black man has a problem, he can go to the white man, can ask for his assistance, and the white man will help him. That's good racism. Now, the political group is a way to really antagonize the Soviets, so as you could argue that, you'll overstress racism, I can play the game too, and in the end it's being dropped. So, after, by the way, the USSR tries to drop the intention part, not to have the intention part, and then the US might find itself in a problem with Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and so forth. So this is the way that this is another dynamic,
Great.
Yeah.
Can I ask about, about that attention part?
Attention or intention?
Intention.
Yeah.
I guess what separates the Holocaust is that idea, particularly
if the Holocaust is
right,
separated.
Right, sure. One argument to separate it would be the idea that Nazi Germany has this idea of setting up an Aryan world order and killing all Jews everywhere. In early stages, they're allowing Jews to leave the country, but then later not, because they're determined to kill all of them. How much does that is the Genocide Convention built into ideas of nation states, where it's, do you have to kill all of this group outside of your country, or is it enough to just kill?
No, according to the Genocide Convention, it's killing in whole or in part.
Right.
So it's really, if theoretically speaking, if I decided to kill all the people of your sort, and I only kill you, because I'm not that good at it, and you catch me before I killed anyone else but you. Theoretically speaking, you can, if you prove that I had killed you as part of a plan to kill all people of your sort, then theoretically no one will go to this length just for that, but in theory I can be guilty of genocide. So it's not a numbers game. It's in whole or in part. Now, with regard to what you actually asked, the Zionist narrative with regard to the Genocide Convention is that it was all about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is unprecedented, hence the Genocide Convention appears immediately after the first genocide was perpetrated. So there is no reason to ask why only in 48, because beforehand there was no. And it's framed for the Holocaust. For example, the ethnic, national, racial, and religious group are not different types of groups, they are synonyms. All synonyms to make sure that Jews, in all the forms you call them, are being protected. and that what the drafters of the convention had in mind is Nazi Germany, hence the notion of intention, because at the time the intentionalist interpretation of the Holocaust, it was fully intentional. Hitler dreamt it, Eichmann did it, this very top-down, simple thinking before doing approach. Hence, the Genocide Convention expects every genocide, should it happen, to look like the Holocaust. Now, when you read the discussions, it's just not like that. They don't think, first of all, they don't know about the Holocaust that much. If there is one thing you can say about the 40s, that a lot of people suffered horrendously. There are so many horrible things going on. The Jews had it bad. No one debates that, but no one thinks in the way we now think of the Holocaust. Now, Elie Wiesel begins with this unique Holocaust in the 60s. Before Elie Wiesel begins with this phrasing of the Holocaust as unique and the theological turn with regard to the Holocaust, now the Holocaust is invoked as the absolute evil. That in this world in which everything is relevant, in which we don't have any solid ground, there is one negative revelation, and that's the Holocaust. That's the crime of all crimes. That's the hallmark of the insanely bad. Now, all those things happen in the 70s, in the 80s. They are not there. First of all, the name the Holocaust isn't there. Shoah is from 61, 62. It's called the war. If you ask my grandparents, they're both Holocaust survivors, they would call it the war. In the 50s, das Churban in Yiddish, it was not yet separated from, this is part of, the notion of intention though, and that's an important issue, the drafting of the Genocide Convention is focused on the problem of over-strong states. That's the big problem of the humanitarian regime currently, that it's mostly focused on the problem of protecting the individual from an overly oppressive strong state. And what we see nowadays, genocides that result from the lack of state, from agencies that are not those of the totalitarian state, well, in the 1940s, weirdly enough, that's not what they think about. That's for them, it's not the lack of state, but the overly strong state.
Other questions or comments? Great. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Alsheh for.
Thank you.